Good evening and welcome to Domination Submission Radio. My name is Mike Makai. I am your host with the most BDSM, DS, kink, and fetish talk on radio. We have a great show for you tonight, but let me just tell you first how you can be a part of the show. We do take calls, and if you want to call in with a question, comment, or a rant, then please call us at 347-857-1862. Again, that number is 347-857-1862. We welcome just about any kind of call. As long as you're civil, we will probably be able to get you on the air. Our topic tonight is BDSM fiction writing. And I think it's an interesting topic that will probably help a lot of people out there who have a book in their heads. I'm sure you've probably heard about 50 Shades of Grey. It was released in 2011, and I think it surprised an awful lot of people. There were very many people who were just astonished that a BDSM book could be so successful. In fact, it was part of a trilogy by E.L. James, the first being 50 Shades of Grey. The second book in that trilogy was released in 2012 called 50 Shades Darker. And then the third book in that trilogy the same year called 50 Shades Freed. And I believe that the success of this trilogy has given a lot of people hope that they're able to follow in the footsteps of author E.L. James and in the kind of success that she has enjoyed with her BDSM novels, which have really taken the world by storm and changed the thinking of a lot of people. I can't even begin to tell you how many people I've spoken to in the last year or so who start the conversation with, I read 50 Shades of Grey and I loved it. It's almost kind of mind-boggling that people so intimately associate this BDSM fiction with a real lifestyle that people are really out there living day to day. And it's a little unnerving in some ways, the amount of criticism that the 50 Shades trilogy has received, particularly from people in the lifestyle. Those criticisms are usually about the fact that it's not realistic, that it portrays these relationships in an unhealthy way, and quite frankly, there are a lot of criticisms about the sheer poor quality of the book. To be perfectly honest with you, I have not read it. I have just heard so many bad things about it that I have been a little hesitant to pick it up and give it a read, and I also don't read a whole lot of fiction. I tend to stay with nonfiction. But let me tell you some interesting bits of trivia about 50 Shades of Grey that you might not be aware of. I mean, I'm sure you've probably heard about it. You may even have read it. But did you know that 50 Shades of Grey has sold 70 million copies in the last 2 years? It has set a world record for the fastest-selling paperback book of all time. It has even beaten the Harry Potter series in terms of number and speed of sales. We're talking a really popular series, and so it's no wonder that we're going to take a closer look at the whole genre of writing BDSM fiction, which at one time was kind of a very narrow specialty genre that would be targeted only to people who really followed it. But the 50 Shades trilogy has kind of opened that up. There are a lot of vanilla people out there reading this stuff now. And so it shines a whole new light on the genre, which I think deserves it. Let me tell you another bit of trivia, which you might not be aware of when it comes to the 50 Shades trilogy, and that is that it started out as Twilight fan fiction. It's hard to believe 50 Shades was originally about vampires, believe it or not. Here's one more little bit of trivia which you may not have heard yet, but it's due to be adapted to film, a movie which is going to be released 1 year from now in August of 2014. So we have that to look forward to. Fiction writing in general is a hard thing to do for a lot of people. In fact, I write nonfiction, and that is what my upcoming book is. It's nonfiction. It's not a novel. And erotic fiction in particular, historically, has been something that you really only saw in adult bookstores. It really hasn't been historically something that you saw on the shelves at Walmart. but it's changing. We're beginning to see things like 50 Shades and books in that genre showing up right on the bookshelves next to your typical vanilla novels, I guess is the best way to put it. And so suddenly we have a lot of people who are considering the idea of becoming erotic fiction authors. Some people are seeing the success of the 50 Shades trilogy, saying, I could have done that. I could do a better job. I have a story in my head that I can tell. And so that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. This show is for those of you who might have a story in your head, who are thinking of putting it to paper, and perhaps joining the ranks of BDSM fiction writers. My introduction to erotic BDSM fiction is going to surprise some of you, I think. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Gore series of novels, which were written by John Norman back in the 60s and all the way up into the 2000s. And he actually wrote about 33 of these books. They were kind of a pulp fiction genre, a mixture of science fiction, erotica, and BDSM, believe it or not, back in the 1960s. And I was introduced to them as an 11-year-old because my father had bought the entire series. Every time a new one came out, he bought it and read it and put it on his bookshelf. He never realized that his 11-year-old son was reading them right after he got done with them, each and every one of them. And each one of these books was about slave girls on the planet Gore, which is also called Counter-Earth. And it was sort of Conan the Barbarian meets Linda Lovelace with whips and chains, I guess. Very erotic, and it dealt almost entirely with slave girls who were always kept in chains and collars and used for sexual gratification. And these women were kidnapped from the planet Earth, taken to this planet named Gore, where they were turned into sex slaves, and it probably has a lot to do with how it turned out as an adult. If you are at all interested in the history of erotic fiction, this is probably a good place to start. It's entertaining books about John Norman, whose actual name is John Frederick Lang Jr., who's a professor of philosophy and has never, ever advocated for sexual slavery or BDSM or anything like that. Believe it or not, he's kind of a mild-mannered guy who is, on one hand, kind of embarrassed by the amount of attention BDSM fiction has attracted, but on the other hand, the money's good and he's not about to stop writing it. So check it out sometime. I think I owe my current state of kinkiness to John Norman's Gore series of novels, and probably to watching a lot of I Dream of Jeannie reruns on television. I really like the way Barbara Eden called that guy master. Well, we have a great interview lined up, and when we get back from the break, we're going to be talking to L.B. Shaw about the art of BDSM fiction writing. You're listening to Mike Makai on Domination Submission Radio. We'll be back in about 1 minute. On Domination and Submission Radio, and our topic tonight is BDSM fiction writing. We've got a great interview lined up here, but let me tell you first about the differences between erotica and porn, the differences between erotic romance and steamy romances, and then how all that fits into the overall umbrella of women's fiction. Because if you are thinking of becoming an author in this genre, you probably need to know this stuff. So what is the difference between erotica and porn? I think most of us are pretty familiar with porn. Not that I would know anything about it, but in pornography, there's really no character development, and no one really cares what the characters are thinking. There's very little personal growth in the characters. There's almost nothing in the way of plot. It's all very situational. And so you and I pretty much know porn when we see it, but how does that differentiate from erotica? Well, erotica generally involves a sexual plot line, but very little romance. And you could not take sex out of it and still have a viable story. So erotica really depends on the sexual aspects of plot. When you're talking about romance versus a steamy romance, there's a little bit more nuance there. An erotic romance chronicles a sexual journey of some sort. And by the sheer fact that it has the word romance in it, means that you absolutely have to have a happily ever after ending, because that's kind of the definition of romance. So if you're writing a book where everyone dies in the end and the world is destroyed by a giant meteor, this is probably not your genre. Erotic romance is a sexual journey, happily ever after. Now, a steamy romance is just a little bit different. If it's a steamy romance, it may have sex in it, but the sex is generally immaterial to the plot line. In other words, you could take all the sex out and you still have a pretty good story. The sex is there for a good reason, and you probably don't want to take all the sex out, but you could if you had to. So that's the difference between erotic romance and a steamy romance. And, of course, those all kind of fall under the umbrella of women's fiction. I don't know if BDSM fiction, as we're discussing it tonight, really falls under that umbrella, but women's fiction in general is about character development, overcoming personal challenges, and may or may not have romantic or sexual elements in it. So if you're going to be a writer, one of the first things you're going to want to do is decide what kind of a writer you are and what sort of thing you enjoy writing. Again, women's fiction, character development, challenges, may or may not be romantic or sexual. Erotic romance is always happily ever after and has some sex in it. Steamy romances can be sexy, but it's not absolutely necessary to the story. And we all know what porn is. So tonight we're going to be talking about some of the things that you might do if you're interested in becoming a BDSM fiction writer. My guest tonight is the author of the Trust in Me series of erotic fiction and 2 books available on Amazon. And he's about to release a third, which is much more BDSM-oriented. It's entitled Becoming Stone. I have with us today LB Shaw. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Do you like to be called LB, or is there some other way you'd like to be addressed?
LB is just fine.
Okay, super. Tell us a little bit about how you got started as a BDSM erotic fiction writer.
Well, first of all, this is my first BDSM novel that I'm currently working on. I got started earlier this year with an erotic romance series, and I guess I just had a lot of fun writing a couple of scenes in there. There was a spanking scene, and it was just something that I enjoyed so much I decided to go ahead and try to write my own. I just started reading a lot of BDSM fiction, and I guess it just sort of, the interest was already there, so I decided that this would be a really fun route for me to pursue.
Mm-hmm. From what you've just told me, I assume then that this is kind of an interest of yours, but not necessarily a lifestyle for you?
It's not a lifestyle. My husband and I do participate in some activities, so I have a bit of knowledge as far as that goes, but we do not live the DS lifestyle or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. In your novels, are you writing specifically about BDSM activities or domination-submission relationships, or a combination of the two?
Well, it's a combination of the two. It starts out as the activities and the mechanics and that sort of thing, and it kind of segues into DS relationship or the potential for a DS relationship. But my novel focuses more on the psychology behind the power exchange. So I really tried to focus on how does my character feel when she's being controlled, when she submits to her dom, and how does that progress throughout their relationship. So I don't focus as much on the toys and the tools, although that is an integral part of the story. But I tried to keep it with things that I'm familiar with so that I could kind of understand my character's perspective and that sort of thing. I guess if I'm being really open, I've never been flogged, but I have been spanked and restrained and slapped and humiliated and pinched and candle wax. So I know what that feels like. I know what it feels like to have that total surrender and that loss of control. And I understand the connection of pain and pleasure and how that can heighten sexual arousal and orgasm. And I understand the connection between being insulted and that making me want to please my master more. So that's what I really tried to focus on within my novel, for the most part.
Were you fascinated with this whole aspect of sexuality before you wrote about it, or did you research and write and become more fascinated with it?
I've always been fascinated with sexuality, I guess, but I think I've always just kind of had this fantasy of being submissive, but I didn't understand it. So I didn't understand that there was a lifestyle involved, that were people involved in this activity. Kind of hard to explain, but I think when I first started doing my research, when I decided to write this type of novel, I began doing research a couple of months ago, and I had already read some fiction, but I read Dr. Charlie Fair's book, BDSM for Writers, and for me it was just like, I don't know, it felt like coming home. It was just like, okay, so I'm not a freak. And I mean, I had some previous knowledge, but I don't know how to explain it, but that's just kind of how it felt to me. Just trying to understand the psychology behind it and that sort of thing.
Have you read the 50 Shades trilogy? And if so, what was your opinion of it?
I have not read it. I think I've read little samples and bits and pieces, so I can't really offer an opinion. I've read a lot of other people's opinions, and I know that it's taken a lot of criticism, and I can understand that because there seems to be this pervading criticism of a lot of BDSM fiction and whether or not it gets an accurate portrayal of the lifestyle and that sort of thing. So, but otherwise I can't really comment on it since I haven't read the whole thing.
Actually, I haven't either. I've heard so much negative press on it that I decided just not to put myself through that. Have you been a writer for a long time, or is this something relatively new for you?
This is relatively new. I lost my job a few years ago, and I started doing some internet marketing. And so for my website, I was writing all of my own article or my blog posts and that sort of thing. And I decided to publish late last year. Well, last year I started working for a company that writes web content for small business websites. So in that sense, I've been writing for close to a year, but I started my fiction writing earlier this year, and I always wanted to publish, but I don't think that I had the confidence to do it. So I remember starting a book like 20 years ago, and it just never got finished. I put it aside because I just didn't think that I could pull it all together.
Did you find many obstacles in pursuing this path?
I personally haven't found any obstacles other than within myself, I suppose. I mean, it's a lot of work, and it requires a lot of focus, and it requires sort of overcoming this fear of failure. And I think that's what a lot of people face. I'm very fortunate in that my husband is very supportive of what I do, and my family has no clue that I write erotic fiction, so it's kind of a secret in that sense. When they ask what I do, I tell them I'm a freelance writer because that's what I do. I mean, I write for websites, I write for small businesses, but I get to sort of hide behind my fiction to some extent. But yeah, I think the obstacles are just a matter of if you have a full-time job and you have to work it in, it can be disruptive to your personal life to some extent, and sometimes it is with mine because I want to write when my husband doesn't want me to write, so I have to face those obstacles and, of course, distractions and that sort of thing. But otherwise, it really hasn't been this terrible thing that I've had to overcome in order to get my work out there.
A lot of people believe that the biggest obstacle is finding a publisher for your work, and you're an independent publisher. Do you think that that's the best way to go for someone like you?
I don't know if it's the best way to go, but I think that there are pros and cons to both. I've never tried to get a traditional publisher, but I think people have these stories of how many rejection letters they have, and so I think that indie publishing sort of takes away that you don't have to hunt down a publisher, and so there's a lot of freedom that comes with that when you can just write your story and publish your own work, but there's a lot of work that comes with it as far as you're having to handle marketing and that sort of thing, too.
What made you decide that a BDSM novel was the way to go with this last novel of yours?
Well, tough question. I guess, like I said, when I wrote my first series, the Trust in Me series, it was just an erotic romance, and it was pretty vanilla. But I kept leaning towards these tendencies to make my male character be kind of domineering and dominating, and so he kind of mess with the female character's head and kind of pretend to threaten to punish her sometimes, and those were my favorite parts of the book. And I guess that was ultimately what made me decide to want to write about it. Plus, I had the characters living inside my head and my own thoughts and my own fantasies. It's sort of a way for me to live vicariously through my characters in a lot of ways. Ultimately, I think that because I enjoyed writing those scenes in my other novel, even though it was BDSM, I thought it would be fun to explore that.
Are there challenges to writing about BDSM erotica versus just your standard erotic novels?
I think it's more challenging in that if you already live the lifestyle, you're at an advantage in a lot of ways, I'm sure, but there's a lot more research that goes into it to understand terminology, and if you're wanting to accurately portray the lifestyle, I personally don't feel that it's necessarily a requirement to portray a healthy BDSM relationship every time, but then you're looking at more of horror, and I think a lot of it is horror. I mean, it's A lot of BDSM is very painful, and I guess that would be the biggest challenge as opposed to writing vanilla, is that it requires a lot more research, and that can be time-consuming.
Is it hard getting into the heads of your characters? Obviously, you can relate, apparently from what you just said, you can relate pretty well to how a submissive or a bottom in a BDSM scene is reacting, but how easy is it for you to write about what's going on in the head of a dominant, for example?
Well, it's not easy. I really have to focus on a lot of his actions from the perspective that I think he might be feeling, and for this particular book, it's written from the first-person point of view of the female character who is the submissive. But, of course, it's still important to understand the motivations of the dominant. And he's, in this particular book, he's a sadist, and particularly an emotional sadist. So it is sometimes hard to get inside of his head. And when I go back and read through scenes and edit, I sometimes will find little inconsistencies. I'm like, wait a minute, he wouldn't do that. And so, yeah, sometimes it's hard, but then again, there are times that I have the opposite problem, that I can't stop thinking about it, and it drives me nuts. So, yeah, it can be maddening sometimes.
When people learn that you are a BDSM erotica fiction writer, do they expect you to be an expert in BDSM? Do they challenge you about the things that you write about?
As far as like social networking, no one's challenged me. But then again, I haven't actually published yet, and none of my immediate family or friends know that I write this, so that's not an issue for me. But I'm sure that other authors come across that, and there's a good chance that I might come across that. If I don't live the lifestyle, how can I write about it? But I don't know. I guess
you don't have to be a murderer to write a murder mystery.
No, exactly. And I thought about that. Somebody, asking me what qualifies you to write this, and I guess my answer would be, well, I don't know that I need to be qualified to write a fiction novel. But for my particular book, it is very dark. It's very edgy, and it's painful, and it's fearful, and so it's written from the characters that are inside my head. And like I said, I really tried to paint the picture of things that I'm familiar with already, so that it will be accurate. But there's a scene where they go to a BDSM club. I've never been to a BDSM club, so I don't know what the inside of one looks like. But I try to focus more on the activities of the characters and what they're feeling, what they're experiencing, and that sort of thing, because that's more important to me than what does the club look like and who's there. And, I do give descriptions, but, again, it's just coming from what I would think, or what I would like to see, what I think my readers would like to hear.
Mm-hmm. Do you believe that the BDSM fiction genre oversimplifies people's motivations and people's desires and needs and those sorts of things? Or do you think it does a pretty good job portraying it as something that is very complex?
I think that if anything, a lot of it probably over-glamorizes or overly romanticizes the lifestyle and the behaviors and reasons why people might choose this lifestyle or this behavior. But so in that sense, it probably does oversimplify it. But the way I see it is relationships are hard enough, whether you're in a vanilla relationship or you're in a DS relationship. There are going to be challenges along the way. But the romance genre overall, whether you're writing BDSM or vanilla, seems to be blanketed by this overarching theme of happily ever after, or at least happily for now, because that's what readers want. They don't want to read stuff that makes them hurt and then it leaves them feeling crappy at the end of the story. They want something that makes them feel good or that's easy and that has a happy ending. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Have you read other BDSM novels by other authors?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of them?
I have read a number of books, and I've read a lot of short stories. I've read Ayla Lords, Susie Ayers, Dylan Cross, Felicity Brandon, John Satisfy. He does a lot of really good spanking stuff, so I like reading his.
Mm-hmm.
Mia Natasha's another one. My favorite is Tiffany Rice, Reisc, and her books are really, really twisted and dark and edgy, but they're funny and they're emotional, and her characters, as dark and twisted as they are, they're all very lovable, and she's just a brilliant writer. So as long as she keeps writing BDSM novels, I will keep reading them.
If someone is thinking about getting into fiction writing, BDSM erotic fiction writing, what kind of advice would you be willing to give them? I would give them probably the same advice I would give if they were writing any kind of novel, which is read a lot and research and connect with other people. I think a lot of people don't use social networking, so it's really important to branch out and connect with other writers. And above all, don't give up. Don't expect to have overnight success. You're not going to hit the bestsellers list with your first book. And just stay focused on writing. Just write, publish, market, connect, and then immediately start on your next work. Very good advice. Do you feel that you have made any major mistakes along your path while pursuing this?
I don't think I've made any major mistakes, but I kind of see mistakes as a good thing because I don't think that you can really succeed without failing at something along the way. But mistakes that I made with my first series, just very simple things like not starting early enough marketing and connecting with other people. And then, of course, I think after I published, I had some people, because I'm in a Facebook group with other writers, and they write in all different genres, but somebody had suggested that I change my cover. And so I changed my cover and changed the price. The price was set a little too high. So at first I wasn't getting any sales. And as soon as I changed my cover and dropped my price down to, I think I went from like $2.99 to 99 cents, then the sales immediately started coming in. And so those were really the only big mistakes that I felt I made along the way. I plan on making some changes when I publish Becoming Stone, the BDSM novel. So I'll probably kind of tweak a few things as needed. And I think that every time you publish, you kind of learn, you have to learn something. I mean, you have to screw up something in order to learn what to do right, you know?
Absolutely. So tell us the title of your book and tell us a little bit about what the storyline is.
The title of the book is Becoming Stone, and it's a BDSM, obviously, but it's sort of a dark romance. The main characters are Katrina and Stone, and Katrina is pretty vanilla. She's in her upper 20s, works in IT, and very perfectionist, very OCD, but she's also very troubled by what she calls her dark fantasies, and they kind of stem from this traumatic childhood event. And no, it's nothing cliche, like she wasn't molested or anything like that, but these fantasies kind of trouble her, and after she makes this huge mistake at work, she decides that she just kind of needs an outlet, and of course here comes Stone to the rescue, and Stone is a dominant, and he eases her into this world of BDSM where she can safely explore her fantasies. However, Stone is a sadist, and particularly he's an emotional sadist, and he pushes Katrina. But it turns out to be perfect because, as it turns out, Katrina is a masochist. So the connection is there, the chemistry is there, but he pushes her really hard. He might be perceived by some as kind of dangerous because he engages in a lot of edge play and that sort of thing. But there's pain, there's fear, and there's struggle in the scenes we see this. But Stone is also a very loving person, and he's kind of a social genius. So he can read Katrina's cues to know how far to push her. But at the crux of their conflict, of course, they fall in love. And Stone, unfortunately, he has a part of himself that he doesn't want to share with anyone, and it's particularly related to his lifestyle. So he has to make a decision as to whether or not to share that part of himself with Katrina so that she will be able to fully submit to him so they can be together. I tried really hard to portray Stone as a loving sadist and to make him likable, and that wasn't easy. I mean, when you talk about getting in the heads of your characters, I really had to focus. As a person who's somewhat of a masochist myself, I think, well, what would I want and what would I need and what would I want to experience? So, but I'd like to share a scene if I can, if that's okay. And I'm not going to read from the book, but
sure.
I just give an example. So everything kind of comes to a head when they go to this BDSM club, and they're enjoying themselves at first, but Stone ends up pushing Katrina just a little bit too far. And I do want to say that everything that they do is consensual, so they go over a checklist, and he knows exactly what she wants and what she's okay with, what she's willing to try and experiment and that sort of thing. So, but he does something that's kind of hurtful to her, and she's kneeling on the floor and she's crying. And she looks up at him and she says to herself, I want him to see me upset. I want him to see the tears, and I want him to acknowledge the pain that he's inflicted on me. But then she realizes she's screwed because Stone is a sadist. So he's gonna like that pain. He's gonna like that fear that he sees in her eyes. So she kind of has this aha moment. But what happens is Stone looks into her eyes, and he immediately, when he sees that she's crying, he immediately stops what he's doing, and he brushes her cheek, and he says, do you need to safe out? And so when he did that, it was like dagger to the heart. So he overlooked his own needs and his own desires for sexual gratification to make sure that she's okay, and he's ready to stop if needed. So I'm hoping that my readers, at least who understand the lifestyle, will see that as an act of love and compassion, and most importantly, control, and his ability to control.
Well, that was going to be one of my other questions was, are you yourself a masochist? And I think you said you are to some extent.
Yes.
Do you have much experience with real-life sadists?
I don't have any experience that I know of. I mean, I I'm more than happy to speak very openly about this, but, when like I said, I started researching the lifestyle and the psychology behind this a couple of months ago, but I've had partners in the past that insulted me during sex, and I loved it. I was too afraid to really talk about it and to say, hey, can you do that some more? And then I've had partners that would choke me, not to the point where I would lose consciousness, but choking, biting, spanking, that sort of thing. So, yes, I've always loved it, and I've been a big porn watcher for a long time. I started watching, BDSM videos probably a few years ago and really wanted to explore some of the things in those videos. So my husband and I actually started exploring some elements of this before I started researching and understanding the mindset behind it, I guess. But, yes, I am a masochist, and I enjoy the pain, different sorts of pain in different places, different parts of my body. And I particularly love to be insulted, and I don't know if humiliated is the right word, because humiliation might involve other people, but I definitely enjoy that. As far as some of that stuff goes, I've only experienced that with my husband, so I can't really say if it were with someone that I maybe didn't trust or know that well, it might not be as enjoyable. But
well, that pretty much applies to almost everything, though. Does your husband know that he's serving as research for your books?
Yes. He knows. He's a very willing participant in helping with whatever research needs to be done.
Well, this is the best kind of homework, I would guess.
Oh,
Tell us how people can find you on the web. I assume you have a website to promote your book?
I do. It's lbshaw.blogspot.com.
Okay, super. And how can they contact you or follow you in social media?
Social media, on Twitter, I am LB_Shaw, and on Facebook, I can't remember.
There should be a link to it on your website, is that correct?
I believe so. Yeah, I should probably check that and make sure.
Do you think your next novel is going to be a BDSM erotica novel, or do you think you're going to branch out into other genres?
I don't know if I'm going to branch out into other genres. I actually have this idea for a somewhat science fiction-y BDSM, and it's just kind of really bizarre. It's just kind of, in my mind, it's very bizarre. I think I'll stick with a BDSM depending on what kind of feedback I get, and if people, I'm thinking about making this a series, the Stone series, and kind of seeing what happens, keeping Stone in the novel throughout the whole thing, and possibly Katrina, depending on what happens with them. So this could possibly be a series, but right now I'm enjoying it enough that I'd really like to stay in this genre.
Well, super. We'll be looking forward to seeing what you put out in this area.
Thank you.
I think your story also gives a lot of hope to a lot of folks out there who may feel that they have a talent for this or would enjoy this, but are a little bit frightened to get out there and get started. Yeah. So I think it's a great thing that you're able to give them some information and a little bit of hope, maybe. So I appreciate you being a part of the show today, and we'll get you on the show more often, particularly if you have some more good stuff to share with us.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. And that was L.B. Shaw, an up-and-coming BDSM fiction writer, about to release her latest novel, which is called Becoming Stone. So we'll be looking forward to that. It should be available in Kindle format on Amazon.com. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. When we get back, we'll talk a little bit more about erotic BDSM fiction writing. We'll also take your calls, so if you have any questions or comments, now's the time to dial in. The number is 347-857-1862. You should write that down because you're going to call me sooner or later. It's 347-857-1862. We'll be back in just a moment. Makai on Domination and Submission Radio on Blog Talk Radio. We just got done with our interview with L.B. Shaw, and there's some really cool things about this interview that bear repeating. One of the most profound things that L.B. said is that relationships are hard enough, regardless of whether they're vanilla or BDSM, and this is true. There are a lot of people out there who are willing to throw BDSM and DS under the bus because they've seen problems in relationships. The difference between the way I think and the way some of those people think is that those people think, well, I'm in a relationship and there are problems, so there must be problems with relationships. And this isn't necessarily true. The way I think is I'm in a relationship and there are problems, so we fix the problem. Not all relationships have problems, and these problems are not inherent or somehow a necessary facet of a BDSM or DS relationship. And so I think it's important that people realize that even if they're not going to become a BDSM or erotic writer, they should understand that there are healthy relationships in the lifestyle. And I spend a lot of time in my book differentiating between DS and BDSM. DS, in my view at least, is what goes on in your head. It's relationship-oriented. It's all about the dynamic between two people and how they relate to one another and how they make each other happy or how they fulfill their desires and needs, emotional desires and needs with another person. When we're talking about BDSM, we're talking about activity. We're talking about something that you do. So this is what happens in your head. BDSM happens to the rest of you. And is there overlap? Absolutely. Very often there's overlap. But you don't have to have one and the other at the same time. Sometimes people have one without the other. There are a lot of people out there who love BDSM but are just not interested in all of the baggage that comes with a relationship. And then, again, there are some who want to feel cared for and dominated and guided and taught, but they really don't want you beaten on their butt with a paddle. And so you should never assume that because someone is into one that they must necessarily be into or knowledgeable about the other. This is not necessarily going to be the case, and I myself have made that mistake a number of times. I've met a lot of people who were into one or the other and not both, or people who mistook one for the other. So it's important to be able to separate and to look at people's real motivations and what they're really into, and not necessarily what they just say they're into. Just because someone says he or she is a dominant doesn't necessarily make that person a dominant. Just because someone says he or she is a submissive doesn't necessarily make that person a submissive. Acting out that role sometimes is exactly that. It's an act. It isn't necessarily a deeply held character trait. And the sad fact is, if somebody's playing a role, all roles become tedious after a while. It doesn't matter how much you enjoy them. Sooner or later, you're going to find another role. And so if you're really into this as a lifestyle, and by that I mean devoting your entire life to it or your entire relationship dynamic to it, you probably want to seek out somebody who has these character traits deeply ingrained in their character. Playing a role could easily be discarded at some point in the future for something equally interesting or fascinating or exciting. So, and if you're going to be a fiction writer, particularly an erotic BDSM fiction writer, then I think it's important that you kind of understand people's motivation, understand a little bit more about the dynamic between a dominant and a submissive, or a dominant and a switch, or a primal and a dominant, or whatever crazy combination you want to come up with. You have to understand that there's a lot more to the dynamic than the whips and chains on a Saturday night. You probably want to get a little bit deeper into their heads and figure out why they do what they do and what they get out of it. Let me give you an example. I, surprise, surprise, am a dominant, but I'm not necessarily a sadist. That doesn't mean I'm not good at doing sadistic things. I can do those things quite well, thank you very much. But I get no satisfaction from the act alone. There has to be some context for me. I have to believe that you want me to do these things to you or for you. I have to believe that you enjoy them. Otherwise, I get absolutely no enjoyment out of doing sadistic things to people. If you're going to become an author, I think you have to understand that there's a context, sometimes a subtle context that's below the surface that people don't really see because it's somebody is superficially looking at me and my activities, they would see possibly me putting someone over my knee and giving them a good erotic spanking or tying them up, and they would naturally assume that I'm a sadist. But I'm not. If you weren't enjoying those activities, it would be a complete waste of time for me because I wouldn't enjoy them either. I would only do these things because I thought you liked them as well. And so if you're going to be a fiction writer and you're going to get into your characters' heads and write a good story, then I think it's going to need a lot more than just the whips and chains and toys and spankings and whatever else you want to work into your novel. You got to have some context, because if it's only about the sexual aspects and the whips and chains and the toys, then it's really nothing more than porn. And trust me, there's not a big future in writing porn. Follow the advice that L.B. Shaw gave us, which was, and this is really important, this is one of the other things I think that bears repeating, and that is her advice was to write, publish, market, and connect. Those 4 things are really, really important. Just start. If you are a budding writer, get started. I think the fear of making a mistake can sometimes just paralyze you, and you just need to get something on paper, write something, even if it's bad, because you can always go back and edit it later. Just get started is all I've got to say. If you're someone who's thinking about getting into this genre yourself as a writer, then I would definitely recommend that you contact some other people who are doing it and compare notes and share tips and advice with each other. It'll go a whole lot easier for you. Been listening to Domination and Submission Radio. I am Mike Makai, the author of Domination Submission, the BDSM Relationship Handbook, due to be released in paperback form in just a couple of weeks. I'm so glad you were able to listen tonight, and I hope you'll be back next week to listen to more Domination and Submission Radio. Bye-bye.